Why am I called the Penguin? Actually, it's one of those names that just happened. Here we have a penguin. At the time that I began selling pens, mostly to support the habit, I was the editor of the Pennant, and so I thought that pen prefix was really useful. And my daughter, who was 16 at the time, and just learning to write HTML, loved penguins. Since she was building the site, she got to name the company. So it kind of evolved out of two different directions. My involvement with the Pennant magazine and then my daughter's obsession at the time. During the early years, these Pelikan pens were always evolving. And one of my pen show parlor tricks is to pick up a pen and go, oh, this pen. Well, that would be from late 1930. Yeah, and the reason I can tell is that I have a kind of rough working knowledge of the evolution of these things. I didn't start as a Pelikan collector. My first fountain pen was a Parker 51 that my father gave me. This is not the same pen. I lost it. But this is the same sort of pen, the ubiquitous Parker 51. For someone of my generation, if you didn't have a 51, you had a Schaefer. It was one or the other. And this is what started it for me. And from there, the Parker 75, after I lost my 51, my parents got me my 75 for when it was time for me to do my doctoral dissertation. And this actually is the actual pen with which I wrote every single word in great pain and suffering at times. And that was my collecting life for a good solid 15 years of my collecting. Was mostly Parkers, American pens. Those were what basically motivated me. My everyday writer became a Parker Senior Maxima Vacuumatic. And quite typically, usually, I mean, I had my choice of colors, obviously, but often it was indeed black. And those were the pens that I used, as I said, until about 1997. And that year, my father-in-law decided that as each of his children and their spouses turned 50, they would get $500. And I had been hearing about this pen, this German pen. Now, I had no problem with German stuff. I was driving a BMW. But it was kind of a shift, and I was interested in it and heard about it on the AOL and CompuServe pen boards back in the day, and started talking about it and whining about it as I do. And when I got the money from her father, my wife said, why don't you stop whining about these pens and just go get one? And in those days, Saul Kitchener, who I am proud to call my mentor, was running a pen desk at Michael's Art Supply just off Union Square in San Francisco, where people gathered. It was as much a community gathering point as anything else. And we would go to Michael's and talk with Saul and all that. And so I went in and asked Saul for what would become my first Pelikan. A Pelikan M800 set in the recently released blue color. And that was my first Pelikan. I would go from there to the vintage pens because that's where I go since I'm a trained historian. But the first one was this M800, and that replaced my dearly beloved Vacuumatics for a number of years. I still go back to the Vacuumatics from time to time nowadays, but my use of pens is much more eclectic than it was back in the day. Fountain pens are not just writing instruments. You can go to the counter of any convenience store and buy a 25-cent pen that will write, and in some cases, honestly, will write better than a poorly set up fountain pen. So why do we do this? Why do we collect pens? Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. I think it's part of it is to become part of a community. Modern day life is very alienating. We don't interact. We don't interact with other people. We don't interact with the built environment. When you're using a fountain pen, you're always conscious of the fact that this is a device in your hand. It's not transparent. It takes a certain amount of effort. And I think that's part of its charm. Once I found myself interested in Pelikans, I almost immediately went to the vintage Pelikans because that was what I had collected, was vintage pens. I tended to disdain, honestly, modern pens. I used to mock modern pens as a $600 pen with a 25-cent filler, and one of the things I liked about Pelikan was this piston filler that they had developed in the late 1920s. So that was my first approach to Pelikans, was to go to the vintage pens and to the classic. That's this. Today most people think of these as a Pelikan 100. It's not. In 1929, Pelikan had only one pen. They didn't number it. Only in 1931, when they began developing other models that I'll show you shortly, did they go back and say, well, this must be the 100 because that's where it started. And you notice that I grabbed the black 100 because that was the standard in German pens. If you were going to have a German pen, it was going to be in black because that conveyed seriousness. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about this guy later, but there's another black German pen, the Montblanc 139. You notice I can put these together, and unlike matter and antimatter, they don't explode. But it was going to be black, but that was pretty much a kind of hedge for Pelikan, because for reasons that I am not aware of and I have never seen mentioned, the head of Pelikan at the time, Fritz Beindorf, who was the son-in-law of Gunther Wagner, the founder of Pelikan, liked green. So here it is, a green pen. Almost heresy. And early on, those of you who know your Pelikans note that this is not the typical striated Pelikan 100 in green. It's what one collector calls the clouds, because it's green and white. It looks more to those of us who know American pens like Schaefer Jade, very much so. And then there was the forerunner of the marbled green Pelikan, and that was this guy. A little bit different markings in the green, but there it is, that marbled green. And then there's my favorite, this guy. It's like a jade green. I've seen several variants of the color. This one is almost teal. Here's a more typical early green. But they didn't stay with that. They pretty much settled on the kind of green striated that we are more familiar with, at least for the 1930s Pelikans. So they followed up their black and green pens with a number of variants. And the supposition has always been that they were developing these variants for Ausland, beyond Germany, that green was as far as the Germans were ready or willing to go. So there were a number of other variants. I think one of the prettiest is the gelb, or yellow, variously called honey. It has picked up a lot of names from collectors. Very lovely pen. A rose red. And then finally a blue striped, not to be confused with the later lapis. We'll get there in a minute. These are all that I've shown you are all Pelikan 100s. That's the number. How do we get beyond the Pelikan 100? We get to the 101. What's the difference? The cap on this pen is black hard rubber. The cap on this pen is celluloid to match the barrel band or binda. So that's the 100. And it came in roughly 10 variants. And I'm going to get to show you only 8 of them today. 2 of them are made of unobtainium, at least for me. So this is the lizard, and it came in 2 variants, the regular and the short cap top. And the story was that the regular Pelikan had this little derby that made the pen very easily taken out of your pocket. Well, the fear was on the part of the Germans that once you get to the Ausland, you're going to encounter thieves and pickpockets and all sorts of unacceptable people. And if you have a Pelikan pen there, you don't want that big cap top. You want something there so that some miscreant can't come and take your pen out of your pocket so easily. That's the legend, the lore. As the Germans would say, wer weiß. Who knows? So we have the lizard here. Then they went into 3 colors. Coral, long and short cap top, blue, long cap top. I know where the short cap top is. I can't shake it loose. And jade. Then the 110, which is white gold filled, to the 111, which is the gold barrel band, the 112, for those of us for whom the barrel band is not enough, we want more gold. There you have it. The 111T, perhaps the most iconic Pelikan ever made. If you look behind me, you will see the cover of the book, the Pelikan 111T for Toledo. And then, about 5 years ago, a number of us were surprised to find that there was something we didn't know about. The short cap top 111T. And these we know of about 5 examples that are left that we are aware of. Are there more? Maybe. Were there more? Probably. But that's what we know of, just 5 of them. And this is one of them. Well, I think that my training as a historian has from the beginning informed my collecting. Initially, it was a research field. I had been trained as a research historian, but my career had not taken me in that direction. So by the time I started collecting in the mid-'80s, when we didn't know as much about pens as we do now, I found that my abilities as a researcher actually informed how I'd approached collecting. So for me, it was always a matter of tracing the chronological development of a pen. I always was attracted to first pens, like this original Pelikan. It taught me about the development of material culture, how exactly humans and machines interact. So I would say that, for me at least, my training and skills definitely shaped the way in which I approached collecting, both as a collector and as a researcher. One of the most intriguing Pelikans, one about which we have only been slow to realize its history, is this, the Pelikan Magnum. The received story for many years was that this was a pen commissioned by Pelikan's Portuguese distributor, MJ. Now what we seem to have learned from original documents, shipping, packing invoices, those sorts of things, is that they developed this pen in 1935, aware of the fact that the traditional style was small and square, and the market by 1935 was demanding streamline. So Pelikan developed this. They must not have liked it. They only produced it for a year. We only see it released in the Portuguese market. But this is sort of, if you will, an evolutionary dead end. It doesn't go anywhere. What you get instead is the 100N Pelikan. This time I'm showing it to you in tortoise. It was available in all of the standard colors, except for the more exotic yellow, blue, red that hadn't sold very well in Germany. They weren't going to continue it. But this is the 100N, this time in tortoise. Another one, some people would say identical. They don't look like it to me, so of course I've got to have them both. The 100N with the short cap top. The 101N, regular and short cap top. And then a variant of trim that came out with the 100N. If you can see this, it is a fluted clip and a fluted cap band. Not a common pen in tortoise. There are enough of them in gray and black, but I haven't seen a whole bunch of these in tortoise. And in addition, apart from just what Pelikan were producing for themselves, they also commissioned jewelers to do overlays. And this becomes really confusing. There's all sorts of pens that purport to be original overlays that were put together within the last 5 years. But the best known of these, and again, an indication of how we're learning about pens as we go along. Initially, we thought this to be one producer, Manner, but we found out with the markings, someone realized, no, that's not a Manner marking. It's from a, I think it was Stuttgart producer called Georg Lauer, or George Lauer, and he did variants of these pens. This one lovely in 14 karat gold with a barley corn striped overlay, also in sterling silver. And there were all kinds of different overlays as the market required and demanded. To me, it's interesting the role of fountain pens in modern life. You know, for someone my age, I have moved from an analog or mechanical world to an electronic world. And certainly that's how most of our writing is today. Most of us don't pick up a pen every day, every hour, to take notes in meetings the way that we used to. At the same time, though, there seems to be a genuine nostalgia for that earlier, perhaps more simple, mechanical world. And so I think for many people, pens are sort of their antidote, if you will, to the digital world, a counterpoint to the digital world, a throwback to a period when things were crafted by hand. You look at the pictures in the Pelikan factory from 1930, and there's rows of people. You go through the Pelikan factory today, there are rows of machines and very few people. So it's a different world, and for many of us, I happen to be interested in cars. I don't drive automatic transmissions. I don't like them. I want to change gears myself. So I think for many of us, it's a way to express yourself in an increasingly digital, electronic sort of world. Those of you who know German pens know that there was a certain decline of quality throughout the war years from about 1940 onward. By 1944, Pelikan could no longer produce pens, and so they stopped, and only would resume in 1947. And the new look was reflected for Pelikan in what would come to be known as the 400. And for many folks, this is the Pelikan that they are familiar with, the 400, because quite remarkably, just as Porsche is still running the same design that they came out with in 1965, although it's changed greatly, for Pelikan, this is a familiar design because they still produce a pen that looks very much like it. But this is the 1950 Pelikan 400. And this particular pen has a number of things that distinguish it and call itself to our attention. One is that it is early enough so that Pelikan were still using these two little slender bands that had marked the 100 and the 100N. So they kept this initially, but after a brief time, and the other thing that makes this an interesting pen is the color, this mother of pearl. Similar to the pre-war tortoise, but much less popular. And interestingly, when you find these mother of pearl pens, you usually find them England, India, Australia, New Zealand, throughout what was then called the British Commonwealth. So from this early pen, you go to the 400N, and again I'm showing this in the mother of pearl, and here you can see that in the 400 as well as the 400N, Pelikan would go to what would be their next band style, just that single band at the lip of the cap. So the 400 later development, this one in gray, a fairly uncommon but not really uncommon color. And then of course the mother of pearl 400N. But again for Pelikan, by 1955 the market was telling them that they needed a restyle. So they restyle the 400 into the 400N. Germans don't like to change things. So if you look at these two pens side by side, the 400, the 400N, there are differences. They're really hard to tell. And that's what the market told Pelikan. They produced this 400N only for 11 months before going to the Pelikan 400NN. If N is for new, NN is for new. Because they had been forced to change this poor thing. Not just one time, but twice. And here you can see with the NN, The restyle is a little bit more obvious, a little bit more direct. And that actually traces Pelikan's development through most of their history. I mean, I could talk about the 500 with a gold-filled cap, or the 600 with a solid gold cap, or even the 700 with solid gold cap and barrel. There was the 140, which was a student pen. Again, another uncommon pen. I chased this pen for about 10 years. And then at one Washington, D.C. pen show, one of the people I know based in London walked across the room with this pen held over his head, looking straight at me. And at that point, the only question was how merciful he would be. He was sufficiently merciful, and I acquired it, but the truth is, the price would have had to have been truly silly for me not to have added this, because it is. Now, do I have all the Pelikan 140s that are known? No. There's a color that I have read about and never seen. These are the things that keep us going. I really don't know how to tell anyone how to collect. I often deal with starting collectors, either someone who is new to fountain pens or someone who has played with fountain pens and they're now interested in Pelikan. And they come to me and they want me to help them build a collection. And the only way to do that is by asking lots of questions, either for me as a vendor to a client or to yourself out there just collecting as a collector. What do you want to do? What's your purpose in collecting? Initially, for most of us, it's I want them. I want them all. And certainly I went through that phase. I could not gather pens up quickly enough. And fortunately, when I started, it was back in the 1980s, when you could expect to buy a pen for less than $50. Not so easy these days. That's why in those days, the old-time collectors, people like my mentor, Saul Kitchener, before his death, had, I would guess, maybe 10,000 pens. I now have what people regard as a very large collection. I don't know how many pens, but it might be as much as 1,000. It's not about sheer numbers anymore. We now, if only because of the cost of these things, we now sort of have to curate our own collections. So you have to decide for yourself as a collector out there, what is it I want to do with these pens? Do I want to buy a lot of Pelikans? Do I want to trace their evolutionary development? What are my own goals for this thing? How am I going to interact with these objects of my desire? Now, after that, and we're talking about the mid-1960s, things got really sketchy for all pen makers all over the world. Nobody quite knew what to do because of the ballpoint pen. So Pelikan goes through some hard times, only to reemerge in 1982 with the development of the Pelikan M400. And basically what that is an, I guess you could call it postmodern evocation of the original Pelikan 400. There had been other models. Pelikan tried designing all sorts of pens that looked modern, were modeled after Parker 61s, 51s, that sort of thing. None of it succeeded. By the late 1970s, the company was in receivership after having tried to produce children's beach toys. Photocopiers that didn't work. Anything that they could to try to stay in business. And by 1978, I believe it was, they were in receivership, only to emerge under new ownership for the first time, not family ownership, in 1982. And with the M400. And that would introduce the modern line of Pelikans, including my first Pelikan, that blue M800. And they produced basically the full line of Pelikan colors, black and green first in the M800. And then there would be a profusion. The blue here, there would be all kinds of other colors that Pelikan would emerge with. This, of course, is the Tortoise Pelikan M800, first released in 1988. And legend would say that it was released for the Spanish market, because the Spanish had been interested in those tortoise pens earlier, for the Japanese market, because the tortoise assumes some symbolic meaning. None of that's true. Pelikan simply decided traditionally to introduce the Tortoise M800. It didn't sell. And there are stories of these pens being offered for sale in the Pelikan outlet store, if you will, for 100 Deutsche Marks, not euros, Deutsche Marks, about 35 bucks. Today, if you can find one, and I have not seen one of these in about 2 or 3 years, and I probably have sold about 10 or 12 of these over the years. The last one I sold was sold for $2,500, and I probably could sell any number of them at that price today if I could get them. For years, hobbyists were begging Pelikan to reintroduce the Tortoise M800. They finally did in 2011, and here you see it, a lovely pen. And once again, these are doing what their original forebears did. They're going up in the market spectacularly. Now, by the current century, by the year 2000, the Pelikan M800 was well established as Pelikan's flagship pen. They began producing all sorts of interesting variants. I'll just hold one of those up here, the so-called Blue O Blue from, I believe, around 2011. My favorite, if only because my car is almost the same color as this, the orange and brown Pelikan M800. The Earth and Sea, or often referred to as the Grand Place, after another model that they produced with this same acrylic. And of course, there have been modern Pelikans all the way from that original M400 of the 1980s to the M600, the M700, a Toledo, the M800, the larger modern Toledo, a whole bunch of other pens. And then inevitably, because Pelikan themselves were proliferating all those models, people in the aftermarket got into producing various exotic M800s, such as this, which was actually made out of a Schaefer acrylic that a maker got hold of and did an extremely faithful reproduction. Or, for those who are more classic, perhaps a silver Pelikan. And Pelikan would do a silver model through Andreas Lambros Classic Pens, but this ain't it. This was made by another aftermarket maker. Something that I actually had commissioned because I like Mokume Gane and I like Pelikan 800s. So you have a Pelikan M800 in Mokume. Sometime in the early 2000s, the Italian distributor of Pelikan decided we could do better than a plain black Pelikan. We can do a laser engraved black Pelikan. Hanover found out about it. They gently knocked on the door and said to the Italians, "You can't do that," and destroyed about 60 of the 100 pens that the Italians had produced. So it's kind of cool. If you've got one of these, you've got one of about 33 or so pens. I know where two of them are. 3, 2. And then someone thought if we're doing retro models, we could go back to lapis and do an M800. This was produced for the approval and ultimately the rejection of Hanover. So some various variants. Oh, forgot one. Transparent Pelikan M800. You're familiar with them in clear and in green and in blue, the so-called blue ocean. Well, this one's in gray. Why'd they make it? Because they could. The only regrets that I have in pen collecting are the pens I didn't buy. Does that mean I never made a mistake in buying a pen? Oh, I can show you rooms of them throughout the house. All kinds of pens that I shouldn't have bought. Or I got home and went, oh, I already have one of those. So there are a lot of regrets that one can have at the small level. But as a collector in general of fountain pens, no. Pens have literally changed my life, and in positive ways, apart from debt. Chrono Swiss thought that these pens were cool, so Pelikan did a version for Chrono Swiss in the traditional green, but with different styling aspects for the pen, for the clip, for the cap top, as they had done with Tiffany before that. So Pelikan was always willing, at least in the modern era, to do variants. And then my favorite of the authorized Pelikans, or factory-produced Pelikans, is the Spirit of Gaudi. They picked up, again being all postmodern, they picked up the overlays that American and European pen makers had used in the early mid-20th century, and they did this lovely overlay, which is one of my very favorite pens. And Pelikan once again succumbed somewhat willingly to market forces and realized that the M800, while it was very popular, was not a large enough pen for everyone. So they produced the M1000. Now the M1000 I've decided to show you today is perhaps one of the most valuable and least common, and that is the M1075. Now you can see the size comparison with the M800. It's not that much bigger. It's a little bit fatter, but it's just big enough. And so Pelikan went through the usual evolution. They produced green and they produced black. That was actually as far as they were willing to go with colors, but then they got cute with transparent versions and various levels of transparency, a cutaway piston mechanism, and then perhaps the Ne Plus Ultra of the Pelikan 1000 line in my hand, the Pelikan 1075, the M1075. This was produced for Pelikan's 75th anniversary. You should be able to see here that the cap was engraved with laser little 75s. I guess they learned that trick from the Italians. The barrel is traditional Pelikan stripes, but this time they're white and yellow gold. And the Pelikan archivist, Jürgen Dittmer, showed this to me. I was aware of it. I had disdained it until I saw it. And then I had to have it. And fortunately, 2 years later, I was able to get one out of Italy. And, well, it speaks for itself, I think. A remarkable pen. What keeps me going as a quote-unquote senior collector, if only because I'm old and I've been at it for a long time? That was actually a crisis for me in my collecting about 7 or 8 years ago. I had gotten a lot of Pelikans. The ones that I didn't have were either pens that I didn't want or pens that I couldn't get, like that short cap top lapis pen that I referred to earlier. So what was I going to do? Was I going to stop collecting? People have closed their collections and they enjoy it, but that's not me. So I took a couple of different approaches. And nowadays, when people ask me what I collect, I admit to the fact that I collect Pelikans. And then that's usually followed by and anything else that amuses me. And just to give an example, at the recent San Francisco pen show, I bought 2 pens. That's all. Just 2 pens, other than what for inventory. I bought this little fellow, a Pelikan Originals of their time. They made about 5 models of those. And this one. It's a 111, an M111, but it's not gold. Well, yes, it is gold. It's white gold. It's 18 karat solid white gold. I don't know how many of these exist, and I didn't know that it existed before I saw it at the San Francisco show, but it had to be mine, obviously. Well, you say, though, that's another Pelikan. So my other pen from the San Francisco show, now those of you who are experienced pen collectors think you know what you're seeing. A Swan 48, right? It's even marked 48 on the butt end of the barrel. The rest of its imprints all read Penna Dante. And on the barrel imprint, Penna Dante, New York. I had never seen one of these before. Letizia Jacopini, the Italian pen collector, when I took this to her, she said, "Oh yes, I know what that is. This was produced by Swan," who you would think, "for Tibaldi before they were producing their own pens." An hour later, I got another story. David Nishimura says, "Yes, I've seen these. There are advertisements for them in the New York newspapers of the 1930s. It was Swan producing a pen for the domestic Italian-American market." Which one's true? Take your pick. So often, the pens today that I find myself collecting are pens that amuse me. This particular pen, replica of where it started for me, the Parker 51, except Parker never made this pen. It's got a Cumberland hard rubber barrel and a hammered brass cap. Or this, just because it amused me, made by Paul Rossi. He called it the 800N because it looks like a Pelikan 100N, but it's about the same size as an 800. Or sometimes the pens that capture my attention are pens made by friends. Bruce Hirschman, who prefers to be known as Bruno Corsini, makes pens. For years I had been after him to make a piston-filled pen. He actually did one better by making a piston-filled pen with this lovely overlay made by Henry Simple. And of course, being who I am, you'll notice the nib is a Pelikan M800. Just can't resist that. The most important part of this hobby or avocation, and that's the people. Pen collectors, are there nasty people in the pen community? Sure, they're everywhere. But some of my closest friends, a lot of the people who are most near and dear to me are pen collector friends, pen collector mentors, people who have helped me develop as both a collector and as a person. Often have been those with whom I have been privileged to know. I guess you could call it new mountains to conquer or something like that. But I think at some point, everyone who deals in pens wants to build or design their own pens. A number of us have done that. My friend Joel Hamilton of Ink Pen has done a number of collaborations. I have done some collaborations with David Broadwell, my friend, and a knife maker. This pen came out of a collaboration between Bruno Corsini and myself. It was a difficult evolution. We came at it, both of us, from different perspectives. But what emerged was a pen that I am very proud to have been able to put the name of the Penguin pen. Made this around 2006. We produced 20 of them plus my prototype and Bruce's prototype. And what was fascinating about putting this together was that we wanted, particularly Bruce was very helpful in reminding me that we were dealing with Pelikans, that we wanted to not do some sort of slavish copy, but something that evoked the design ethic of Pelikan. And we came up with this pen. Now, Bruce very well knew what he was doing. I didn't. I had no idea what we were doing. And the fascinating thing here is that when the pen came together, it sat in my hand, this great big pen, just the way this does, by doing enough of an homage to the Pelikan design. We were able to put together a pen of our own making that very much felt like what we thought the ideal would be in pen making. A lovely project, and I am eternally grateful to Bruce for having put up with me during its evolution.
Mind blown.
Well, good.